Sleet slid down the back of Catherine Muller's collar as she crossed Covent Garden before full light, a trunk strap cutting into both palms until the thin kid leather of her gloves darkened and stuck to her skin. The market had begun in grey murmurs and iron clatter. Carts rolled over rutted stones. Porters shouted prices for winter pears and turnips and eels packed in salt. Wet straw clung to the hem of her skirt. Every third step drove cold water through the seam of her left boot and into her stocking. She did not slow. Lady Whitcomb's parcels shifted against her shoulder, silk boxed in paper and tied with ribbon, gowns bought on credit that Catherine would never be permitted to touch except to carry and brush and mend. Men in rough coats looked at her once, then looked again when they recognised the crest stamped on the trunk lid. Not a servant then, not a lady either. A curiosity balanced between classes, bent under another woman's wardrobe while the fishmonger's boy smirked and an old woman selling herbs said, to no one in particular, "They break the quiet ones first." Catherine kept her face level. She had learned to carry pain without expression, because expression invited instruction, and instruction from Lady Whitcomb always arrived in public. Her fingers had gone numb by the time she reached the corner where the wind tunnelled between stone buildings and drove sleet under her bonnet. She shifted the strap higher. The leather burned where it had already rubbed skin raw. Her stomach cramped once, sharply at the smell of hot chestnuts from a brazier she could not afford to approach, then settled into the familiar hollow ache that had followed her through most mornings since October. She had eaten a crust before dawn in the scullery, standing because chairs were for family and guests, and she was neither. The porter at Whitcomb House opened the side gate and did not offer his hand. He had watched this ritual for 2 winters and had learned what happened to servants who showed her kindness where Lady Whitcomb might see. Catherine crossed the narrow yard alone, boots slipping on thawing ice, and carried each box through the service door into the back passage that smelled of coal dust, damp wool, and polish. Upstairs in the drawing-room, firelight already moved over ormolu mirrors and pale blue walls. Lady Whitcomb stood at the mantel in plum silk that rustled when she breathed, lavender scent filling the room before she spoke. She did not look at Catherine's face. She looked at the droplets on the trunk and the faint track of mud on Catherine's hem. "You are late by 6 minutes." Catherine set the trunk down with care because one cracked clasp would become a week of penalties. "The roads were ice, my lady." Lady Whitcomb turned then, cool eyes moving over Catherine's wet sleeves and reddened hands, as if appraising damage to a purchased object. "Excuses are vulgar. You will lay out the dove-grey gown, then inventory the winter lace, then copy Mrs. Felton's guest list in a fair hand. You will use no candles after 10. Wax is dear." She paused, and the pause carried pleasure. "Miss Eleanor requires the pearl slippers stitched by luncheon. You stitched them poorly the first time." Catherine inclined her head. "Yes, my lady." The elder stepdaughter laughed from the settee where she sat with chocolate untouched at her elbow. "Poorly and slowly. Father said she had a scholar's mind. See what good that has done?" The younger one adjusted a ribbon at her throat and added, "Do not drip on the carpet, Kate. It is French." Catherine lifted the trunk again and felt the cut in her palm open under the strap. Warmth spread beneath wet leather. She did not look down. She did not speak. The house had once echoed with her father's German baritone, and the scrape of his chair drawn back from the breakfast table. Now it answered to silk and laughter and keys turning in locks she was not permitted to touch. By the second week of December, the pantry key had become a small iron emblem of rank, worn at Lady Whitcomb's waist, beside a vinaigrette, and a watch set with seed pearls. And Catherine had stopped asking for tea at night because refusal delivered twice in one day left a mark that no rouge covered. She moved through the house in circuits no one else mapped. Nursery fire at 6, correspondence trays at 7, mending basket in the morning room before calls, carriage rugs aired by noon, account copies after dusk. She ate what remained when the plates returned from above stairs, bread ends, cooled broth skimmed to water, a heel of cheese trimmed to hide mould. Hunger sharpened sound. She could hear a teaspoon strike porcelain in the front parlour from the back stair landing. She could hear Lady Whitcomb's bracelets before the door opened. She could hear from her attic room under the eaves the ballroom pianoforte being tuned for other people's evenings. The attic held a narrow bed, a washstand with one cracked basin, and a trunk of her own with a broken hinge that would not close fully. In that trunk, under mended stockings and a winter shawl gone thin at the fold, she kept her father's grammar of commercial German, 2 ledgers copied in her own careful hand, and folded sheets of numbers that did not agree with the figures Lady Whitcomb had presented to solicitors. Johann Müller had guaranteed a shipping note for a partner who vanished before maturity. That was the version spoken in drawing rooms, with pity for a man too trusting and contempt for a daughter too educated to be useful. Catherine had read the original bills. She had read endorsements inserted in a second ink. She had found dates altered by 1 day, enough to trigger penalties that devoured capital like rats through grain sacks. Her father had not been foolish. He had been cornered. She copied by candlelight because proof survived better in duplicate, and because numbers obeyed rules, cruelty could not charm away. On this morning the house prepared for callers, and preparation meant that everyone else became visible while Catherine disappeared into function. She knelt on the corridor runner to scrub a streak of carriage mud from the lower panelling where no guest would ever look, wrists aching, knuckles split from lie, then rose too quickly and saw black at the edge of her sight until she steadied herself against the wall. In the servants' hall, cook pressed half an apple into her hand without meeting her eye. "Take it now," the woman muttered. "Do not thank me." Kindness had to move like contraband in Whitcomb House, swift and deniable. Catherine ate the apple in 2 bites on the back stair, cold sweetness stinging a cracked lip, then carried hot water up to Miss Eleanor, who complained the steam dampened her curls and sent the jug back untouched. She lifted coal scuttles. She stitched torn lace with thread so fine it cut grooves into her fingertips. She fetched Lady Whitcomb's writing case from the blue salon and waited while that lady dictated invitations in a voice trained to float over cruelty like perfume over rot. "You will remain in the anteroom when Mrs. Danvers arrives," Lady Whitcomb said without turning. "If she asks whether you are my relation, you will say you are my companion. You will say it clearly." Catherine held the writing case against her hip. "Yes, my lady." The rustle of silk moved closer. Lady Whitcomb adjusted the angle of Catherine's chin with 2 fingers, not gently. "And do not attempt that earnest stare. Men mistake it for intelligence. It is unbecoming in your circumstances." Catherine lowered her eyes because defiance cost bread and coal and sleep. Heat climbed her throat anyway. Her pulse beat hard beneath the bruise hidden by her cuff, a bruise from the previous evening when a tray had slipped and Lady Whitcomb's patience had ended against Catherine's wrist. She breathed once, then twice, then returned to the corridor with the writing case and a face as blank as plaster. Late that afternoon, when rain replaced sleet and the windows sweated with warmth she could not claim, Catherine carried clean linen to the attic and barred her own door with the trunk lid because the latch no longer caught. She struck one candle. The flame trembled in the draught and steadied. Her room smelled of damp wool and old paper. She unpinned her hair and shook it loose only long enough to dry the roots by the small grate, then twisted it back up because loose hair was called vanity, and vanity was punishable. She peeled off her gloves and winced at the skin beneath, ridged and blistered where the trunk strap had bitten deep. She washed her hands in water gone grey with ash. The sting made her jaw tighten. On the bed she spread 3 sheets copied from her father's books, and one letter, in a solicitor's hand, that Lady Whitcomb believed burned months ago. It had not burned. Catherine had lifted it from the grate with tongs, while embers still glowed, and pressed it flat under a dictionary until the singe marks stopped curling the edges. The letter referenced a transfer of dowry securities to cover emergency household debts, dated 3 days before her father died, signed in a hand that imitated his slant, but missed the pressure on downstrokes, a forgery made in haste, a theft made legal by mourning. Rain ticked at the roof like fingernails. Voices rose and fell below her as guests arrived for tea, laughter spilling upward through floorboards she was forbidden to cross while company remained. Catherine copied another column, then another, candle guttering low. Her back burned from lifting, her feet throbbed inside damp stockings, and the hunger returned as a slow turning knife beneath her ribs. She set down the pen only when the church bell struck 10, and wax became by decree too dear for her light. In darkness she slid the papers beneath the mattress, laid her raw hands flat on the coarse blanket, and listened to the house that had once been her home breathe around her like a locked chest. In darkness, with the rain still worrying the slates above her head, memory arrived as bodily fact rather than story, each old year lodged where hunger now twisted. Her father had once carried her down these very stairs on his shoulder when she was small enough to fit against his neck, his laugh loud in the entry while clerks waited with account books and wet boots and apologies. Johann Müller had smelled of ink, wool and tobacco leaf. He had spoken English in public and German to her when he taught her numbers, tapping each column with a blunt forefinger until she understood that sums were a language no liar could speak for long. "Read the date first," he used to say. "Always the date." The house then had been warm in honest ways, kitchen heat that reached the back passage, lamps lit before dusk, bread cut thick, no locks on pantry doors. Her mother had been dead by the time Catherine turned 14. A quiet portrait in the morning room and a silver hairbrush wrapped in linen. And for 1 year after that loss, father and daughter had moved around each other like 2 people carrying the same fragile bowl. Then came Mrs. Felicity Whitcomb, newly widowed, all polished civility and lavender water, with 2 daughters in pale muslin, and a voice that never rose because it did not need to. Catherine had watched the courtship from doorways, old enough to see the arithmetic beneath the tenderness. Her father needed social shelter in a city that distrusted foreign merchants when any cargo arrived late. Mrs. Whitcomb needed ready money and a respectable address after her own husband's creditors closed around her household. They married in June. By Michaelmas, her mother's portrait had been moved to the upper landing. To preserve it from smoke, the silver hairbrush had vanished, and the household accounts were simplified under Mrs. Whitcomb's supervision. Catherine was 17 when her writing desk was reassigned to Miss Eleanor for music copies, 18 when her piano practice hour was called self-indulgent, 19 when she was told she would no longer receive pin money because she was past the age of frivolity. None of it came as a blow that could be named and resisted. It came as small removals. A key no longer available. A door now closed. A bill not shown. A servant dismissed and replaced with one loyal to Lady Whitcomb. By the winter her father died, Catherine had already been trained out of asking where anything had gone. He had died in late November after 3 nights of fever, and one morning in which he tried to rise and demanded his red ledger in a voice gone thin as paper. Lady Whitcomb had stood by the bed in black silk, composed and efficient, and said the physician required quiet. The ledger did not come. Catherine could still feel the damp heat of his hand when he caught her wrist and whispered in German, words broken by cough and pain. Not the revised pages, the first set, bottom drawer. Then his breath had hitched, and she had bent close enough to hear one final instruction, shaped against her hair. "Do not sign." He had been buried under a sky the colour of tin. 3 days later, Mrs. Whitcomb became Lady Whitcomb in practice, if not in patent, taking control of correspondence, retaining her own solicitor, and announcing to callers that the estate had been left in a precarious state due to "my poor husband's sentimental guarantees." The phrase travelled through drawing rooms like perfume. Men repeated it with sympathetic frowns. Women repeated it with mild satisfaction, as if disaster confirmed a moral lesson. Catherine had sat through condolence visits in a black dress let out twice at the seams and listened to strangers explain her father to her. She had gone numb in the hands first, then in the face. Within a fortnight, Lady Whitcomb dismissed 2 senior housemaids, sold 6 pieces of silver, and moved Catherine from the second-floor family room to the attic for economy. The sisters took inventory with bright attention that bordered on delight. Miss Eleanor selected 3 of Catherine's day dresses, because they suit my colouring better. Miss Agnes took the garnet comb their father had brought from Hamburg, and wore it to church the next Sunday. When Catherine protested quietly, with the comb still warm from another woman's hair, Lady Whitcomb had tilted her head and answered in the measured tone she used for public rebukes. "Your father left debt, Miss Muller, not heirlooms. Gratitude would become you." The worst of it had been procedural. The dowry account, established in Catherine's mother's marriage settlement and enlarged by her father each quarter, was declared temporarily inaccessible pending reconciliation of liabilities. The lockbox key disappeared. The passbook disappeared. Catherine was told the matter was under legal review, then told speaking of money made her unfit company, then told no gentleman would consider a woman who argued about figures. She learned that theft committed with stamped paper and proper witnesses left no bruise to exhibit. She learned to answer "Yes, my lady," while the muscles in her jaw trembled from clenching. She learned that grief could be administered like a household inventory until the person who mourned became another item reassigned, revalued, and consumed. By the first week of January, in the year after his burial, the language of debt governed every hour she drew breath in Whitcomb House. Coal rationing for the upper floors meant frost on her basin each dawn, while the front drawing-room glowed for card parties. Bread was counted, candles were counted, laundry soap was counted. Yet Lady Whitcomb's own purchases continued in careful splendour, never vulgar, never excessive in any single bill, always defensible and therefore untouchable. 1 bolt of lion silk charged to deferred account, 1 pair of kid gloves from Bond Street, 1 bracelet reset from family stones, 1 commission paid to the dancing master for additional instruction of the girls. The daughters learned quickly that cruelty too could be practised as a social grace. Miss Eleanor began using Catherine's Christian name only when issuing orders she had heard her mother give to servants. Miss Agnes preferred diminutives, calling her Kitty in front of guests, with a smile sharp enough to cut. They borrowed her shawl and returned it singed at the fringe. They sent her back down 2 flights for ribbons they never intended to wear. They laughed if she stumbled, When callers asked whether she played, Lady Whitcomb answered for her. "She copies music very neatly." When an older gentleman inquired whether Miss Muller had prospects, Lady Whitcomb let her gaze pass over Catherine as if examining weather. "Ah, dear Kate, is a comfort in the house. One does not rush to lose such utility." The room had chuckled. Catherine had stood by the tea-tray and felt the laughter settle on her skin like soot. She had gone upstairs that night and, instead of crying, opened her father's grammar and translated 3 pages of maritime insurance clauses until the words became steady ground again. Numbers did not sneer, dates did not preen, ink did not lie unless a hand forced it, and forced hands left traces if one knew where to look. She found them in the ledgers Lady Whitcomb allowed her to copy for practice. Altered maturity dates, duplicate charges entered 2 days apart, freight losses claimed against cargo that had arrived and cleared customs, and transfers from the dowry securities into household maintenance signed with initials that matched no authorised trustee. She hid each transcription under her mattress, then copied each one a second time and stitched the duplicates into the hem of an old petticoat, because paper could burn, but seams were rarely inspected. Once in March, Lady Whitcomb caught her reading a solicitor's circular in German near the window, and struck the page from her hand so hard the edge cut Catherine's cheek. "No one values a woman who looks clever," she said, silk whispering as she turned away. Catherine touched the sting, tasted iron at her lip, and answered with the obedience expected of her station. "Yes, my lady." What she did not say had become the only possession no one could seize, that she remembered every figure, every forged signature, every date shifted by 1 day to turn protection into penalty. In the dark now, rain easing to a fine hiss above the eaves, she folded that litany around herself like a blanket too thin for warmth, but strong enough to endure the night. A hard knock struck her door before she could lie down, then a second, lower and sharper, wood against wood, like a warning given by someone who expected no delay. Catherine pushed the papers beneath the mattress with one sweep of her arm, slid the grammar under the blanket, and set her trunk lid flat as if it had never served as a bar. "Come!" The latch lifted. Martha from the lower hall stood there with a candle and a face drained of colour, apron still dusted with flour from the kitchen. Behind her on the stair, Lady Whitcomb's lavender reached the room before Lady Whitcomb did. "Downstairs." "Now," Martha whispered, eyes darting once to Catherine's bed, once to the floor. Catherine slipped her hands into dry gloves to hide the ridges in her palms and followed. The attic stair swallowed light in narrow bands. Her bare wrist stung where the cuff rubbed yesterday's bruise. By the time they reached the blue salon, the fire had burned low and only one lamp remained lit. Lady Whitcomb stood at the escritoire in bronze silk, shoulders straight, 2 folded sheets beside her hand, and sealing wax still soft in the dish. Miss Eleanor lounged by the hearth in rose satin. Miss Agnes sat on the ottoman with a dish of sugared violets in her lap. Both looked up as Catherine entered, with that bright attention predators gave to a trapped thing that still moved. Lady Whitcomb did not offer a chair. She lifted one folded sheet and held it out between 2 fingers. "Read." Catherine took the paper. The seal was Lady Whitcomb's own. The hand was the same precise slant used for legal instructions and dinner invitations, sharp on the downstroke, ornamental on the capitals. She read once, then again because hunger could blur a line and this document was meant to bruise where a slap might leave evidence. Miss Catherine Muller, companion to Lady Whitcomb, would attend the midwinter assembly tomorrow evening. She would stand with Lady Whitcomb until called forward. She would wear the gown provided and obey all directions given by Lady Whitcomb regarding conversation and dance. She would not decline introductions. If she refused attendance or failed in obedience, she would vacate Whitcomb House at once, without wages, without references, and without claim upon any household article not expressly gifted in writing. "You understand?" Lady Whitcomb asked. Catherine kept her gaze on the page. "I understand the words, my lady." "Then understand the arithmetic beneath them," Lady Whitcomb said, voice level as cut glass. "A woman without references does not secure a post. A woman without a post does not secure a room. This weather kills the proud within a week." Miss Eleanor gave a soft laugh and dipped another violet in sugar. "Do not look so stricken, Kate. You may be useful at last." Miss Agnes tilted her head. "Stand still tomorrow, and perhaps someone charitable will take an interest." Lady Whitcomb stepped closer, silk whispering over carpet, and tapped the lower line where her own signature sat. "You will sign acknowledgement." She pushed a pen toward Catherine. Catherine set the first sheet down and did not touch the pen. "Companions are paid wages, my lady. Mine have been withheld 14 months. This says I leave without wages owed." Lady Whitcomb's bracelets clicked once at her wrist. "This says what I require it to say." "It is not lawful." The words left before Prudence could swallow them. Silence widened in the room. The daughters watched with open delight, waiting for impact. Lady Whitcomb smiled, not with warmth, but with patience sharpened by contempt. "Lawful is what can be proved by those who can afford proof. You can afford nothing." She laid the second sheet over the first. It was shorter. A list of household debts. Catherine's name at the bottom beneath a declaration that she had accepted maintenance in lieu of wages, forged already then, or prepared for coercion. Catherine felt the cold move under her skin. Lady Whitcomb lowered her voice. "Sign one line tonight, and tomorrow passes without spectacle. Refuse, and I send Mrs. Felton to inventory your attic before dawn. Every scrap, every seam. Do not force me to discover what you hide." The threat landed where it had been aimed. Papers under mattress, duplicates stitched in hem. One search and years would turn to ash in a coal grate by breakfast. Catherine placed her fingers on the edge of the desk to steady the tremor in her hands. "May I read both pages by daylight?" Lady Whitcomb's eyes narrowed. "No." Catherine inclined her head. "Then I ask until morning, my lady, on account of witness. If I sign in witness." Miss Eleanor clicked her tongue. She believes herself a barrister. Lady Whitcomb studied her for one long breath. "Morning, then. You will be dressed by 6 in the evening. Martha will bring the gown. If there is one loose thread, one misplaced curtsy, one syllable not sanctioned by me, you leave this house that hour." She took up the papers, sanded them, and slid them into a red leather case. "Go!" Catherine turned, and Lady Whitcomb spoke again before she reached the door. "And Miss Muller—" Catherine stopped. "Wash your face. You look half-starved. Men prefer health." Catherine did not answer. In the passage, Martha caught her sleeve and pressed a wrapped heel of bread into her palm so quickly it felt like theft. "Hide it," she murmured. "Mrs. Prentice is checking trays." Catherine nodded once and climbed the attic stair with bread in one hand, and both lungs held tight against panic until the door closed behind her. By the following evening, sleet had hardened to rain that struck the carriage roof in relentless bursts, and the borrowed gown cut under Catherine's arms each time the wheels jolted over broken stone. The fabric was pale green satin from Miss Eleanor's cast-offs, taken in badly at the waist, too narrow across the shoulders, and trimmed with beadwork that scratched her collarbone whenever she breathed deeply. Martha had pinned the hem twice. The pins still dragged at the worn lining of Catherine's petticoat. Her slippers had been dyed to match, but one sole had split where old glue met fresh damp. Lady Whitcomb sat opposite her beneath the carriage lamp, velvet mantle clasped at the throat, lavender and amber powder masking the smell of wet wool. Miss Eleanor and Miss Agnes flanked her like polished reflections. "Do not speak first," Lady Whitcomb said, as the carriage slowed near the assembly rooms. "Do not decline any request I permit. Smile when addressed. Lower your eyes when corrected." Miss Agnes adjusted her gloves and looked Catherine over with clinical disdain. "Try not to limp," Miss Eleanor added, "and if anyone asks your portion, you will say nothing. Mother will answer." Catherine folded her hands over the ache in her left palm, where yesterday's strap wound had reopened under sewing. "Yes, my lady." The vestibule air hit like a furnace after the street. Wax, perfume, damp coats, wet leather, cardamom from mulled wine. Footmen took cloaks. Names were announced in a rolling cadence that sorted rank in under 2 breaths. Chandeliers burned high over the long room, each crystal trembling with reflected light. Music from the far end skimmed across conversation, violin and pianoforte, stitched over 100 voices. Catherine stood where Lady Whitcomb placed her, just beyond the crush near the first column, visible enough to be appraised and not important enough to be greeted. She held her shoulders straight. She kept weight off the split sole. Men looked, then looked away when they saw no mother presenting her, no uncle behind her, no card declaring fortune. Women in silver gauze measured her gown and found the seams wanting. A dowager with sapphires at her throat asked Lady Whitcomb, "A relation?" Lady Whitcomb smiled with practised regret. "A companion, industrious. We keep her from loneliness." Miss Eleanor's fan hid half her mouth as she laughed. Catherine kept her face composed and felt heat crawl up her neck, not from shyness, but from the old humiliation of being translated in front of her own body. An hour into the crush, the room had thickened with warmth and gossip, and her empty stomach had become a hard knot under satin. She had been corrected for standing too near the mantel, corrected for standing too far, corrected for failing to smile while a gentleman with tobacco breath asked whether she played cards for steaks. She had not been offered supper. When a new set began and dancers crossed toward the centre, Lady Whitcomb leaned close enough that Catherine felt the chill of her jewelled earring against her cheek. "Move to the musician's side. Let yourself be seen." Catherine obeyed. 2 steps into the turn of the floor, the left slipper gave way. The outer seam split clean from arch to heel. Her foot slid. Pain shot bright as wire up her calf. She caught the nearest chair back before she fell. A bead from the hem snapped loose and skittered over polished boards. The nearest pair glanced down, then away. One of the younger men laughed into his glove. Catherine drew her damaged foot behind the other and reached for the edge of her skirt to hide the break. When she shifted, wet warmth spread at her heel where skin had torn. "Dance!" The voice came from her left, low and flat, not loud enough to carry beyond them and not shaped as a request. Catherine turned. The man before her stood taller than most in the room by a full head, broad through shoulder and chest, evening coat cut in severe black that made every other gentleman's finery look ornamental. Dark hair, no powder. A scar ran pale from the angle of his jaw toward his ear and vanished under his collar. His face was composed to stillness that looked less like calm than restraint. She knew him one heartbeat after seeing him, not because she had ever been introduced, but because half London had repeated his name in cautious tones for 3 seasons. Adrian Vale, Viscount Harrowmere. younger brother to the Earl of Thornfield, brother now dead, patron of winter assemblies until grief turned him silent and seldom seen. His eyes rested on her with unnerving precision, as if he had already counted each frayed seam and bruise and found no need for politeness around facts. "My lord," she said, because failing to use title in that room could end a woman faster than debt, "I'm not entered for this set." "Dance." "I cannot." She kept her voice low. "My slipper." "I saw it split." He extended his hand once. "You will not stand against that wall while they inspect you." The words struck harder than the command. She looked past him toward Lady Whitcomb. Her stepmother had gone very still near the column, fan frozen half open. Miss Eleanor's mouth had sharpened with irritation. Miss Agnes watched with avid surprise. Catherine's pulse climbed into her throat. Refusing a Viscount in full view could be read as insolence. Accepting without Lady Whitcomb's leave could be punished before morning. She placed her fingers in his hand because one danger was immediate and the other familiar. His palm was warm. His grip was firm, without pressure. He led her into line with a directness that made space open before them, where moments earlier none had existed. The first turn dragged pain through her left foot. She faltered. His hand shifted to support, not display. "Weight on your right," he said. "Shorter step." She obeyed and found she could move if she kept her heel clear. Their orbit carried them past mirrored panels and nodding heads. Conversation thinned near them, then resumed in lowered tones. He did not perform charm. He did not fill silence. He watched her once, then the room, then her again. "You are shivering," he said. "The room is overheated, my lord." "Liar." The word was quiet, almost clinical. "Your gloves are damp through. Your left sleeve hides a bruise. You have eaten nothing since noon." Catherine's breath caught. "You presume much." "I count what I see." His jaw tightened, scar pulling faintly at the skin. "You were sent here to be traded." She could have denied it. She could have offered the polite fiction Lady Whitcomb required. Instead, she heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. "I was sent here to obey." His gaze held hers for one beat, then shifted to the figures around them. "Not tonight." The set turned. Her split sole slid again. He adjusted course so they passed farther from the densest press and nearer the edge where the floor had less polish and more grip. An older lady watched them over her fan with blatant curiosity. Two young officers exchanged looks. Somewhere behind Catherine, Miss Eleanor laughed too brightly at something no one had said. The music climbed toward cadence. Vale spoke without looking at her. "Does she strike you in public or private?" Cold moved through her spine. "My lord, this is not a proper question." "It is the only proper question in this room." She tightened her hand once against his sleeve and released before anyone could mark it. "If you seek scandal, you have chosen poor quarry." "I do not hunt scandal." His voice lowered further. "I hunt leverage." The final figure brought them to stillness. He did not release her at once. The pause lasted no more than 2 breaths. It felt longer. "When this set ends, return to the anteroom by the east staircase," he said. "Do not return to Lady Whitcomb's side until I have spoken." Catherine looked up at him, startled enough to forget caution. "You cannot command my movements, my lord." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, and gone before she could decide if she imagined it. "No, I can offer you one unobserved corridor and 10 minutes without her hand on your sleeve. Take them." He stepped back then, bowed with exact correctness, and released her fingers. Around them, sound rushed in again, fans opening, slippers turning, whispers catching spark. Catherine moved toward the edge of the floor on her uninjured foot, heartbeat hammering against the tight bodice, and did not look toward Lady Whitcomb until she reached the shadow near the musicians, where she found, with a shock that tightened her throat, that the Viscount had already turned and was walking straight toward her stepmother, as if he had every right in the world to ask her anything at all. He crossed the floor with the same controlled stride he had used in the dance, and the crowd parted before him, as if rank were a physical force rather than a title spoken by an usher. Catherine stayed in the shadow of the musicians' chairs, one hand closed around the torn edge of her skirt, and watched Lady Whitcomb turn to meet him with a smile polished bright enough to blind a less careful man. Miss Eleanor lifted her fan. Miss Agnes leaned in, eager. Vale bowed once. Lady Whitcomb answered. Their mouths moved. No sound carried through the swell of violins and talk. Lady Whitcomb's expression shifted half a degree from social warmth to alert calculation. Vale said something else, very brief. Then he inclined his head and stepped away before she could reclaim the rhythm of the exchange. Lady Whitcomb did not watch him go. She watched Catherine. The look reached across 20 feet of waxed floor like a thrown knife. Catherine felt it in her throat before she felt it in her bones. Miss Agnes said something at her mother's shoulder and laughed with her teeth. Lady Whitcomb gave the smallest motion of her fan. "Come!" Catherine crossed the margin of the room, on her right foot, keeping her damaged heel clear of the boards. She stopped at the exact distance expected of a dependent who had been called but not addressed. Lavender and amber powder rose from Lady Whitcomb's mantle. The Viscount was nowhere in direct view now. That did not ease her. "What did you say to Lord Harrowmere, Viscount Vale?" Lady Whitcomb asked without moving her smile. "He asked for the set. We danced. We exchanged no confidence, my lady." Miss Eleanor's fan snapped shut. "No confidence! Hear her!" Lady Whitcomb's eyes held Catherine's face with cold precision. "You will go to the east anteroom by the staircase and remain there until I send for you. You will not speak to any gentleman in passage. You will not seek refreshment. You will wait." "Yes, my lady. And Miss Muller." The fan tapped once against Lady Whitcomb's wrist. "If you have misunderstood your position because a Viscount held your hand for 6 minutes, correct yourself at once." Catherine bowed and turned before her expression could betray the burn under her ribs. She moved through clustered skirts and black coats toward the side corridor Vale had named, each step measured against the pull of torn leather at her foot. Behind her, conversation rose and fell in polite ripples, but one tone followed, sharper than the rest, the tone reserved for spectacle disguised as concern. By the time the second quadrille was called, the east corridor had emptied of all but servants carrying trays and one elderly footman, straightening candelabra sconces with a cloth that left streaks of brightness in the brass. The air there was cooler, touched by damp from the stairwell and the faint medicinal scent of beeswax polish. Catherine reached the anteroom door, found it unlatched, and slipped inside. The room had been arranged for discarded cloaks and tired conversation, not for display. A low fire, 2 narrow settees, a gilt mirror that had darkened at the edges. Someone had left a half-finished glass of ratafia on the mantel and a damp glove on a chair. Catherine shut the door almost fully, keeping a narrow strip of hallway light, then sat on the nearest settee and lifted her skirt enough to inspect the damage. The slipper seam had opened from instep to heel. Blood had marked the lining in a crescent where skin had split. She pressed her lips together and pulled the pin from her hem with careful fingers. One pin became 2. She bent the metal into a makeshift clasp and fastened the leather as tightly as she could without driving it into flesh. It would hold for standing, not for dancing. The anteroom door moved before she could lower her skirt, not Lady Whitcomb. A maid she did not recognise, perhaps from one of the larger houses, stood in the gap with a stack of folded napkins and startled eyes. "Beg pardon, miss, I did not know anyone was in here." "You may pass," Catherine said, and shifted to make room. The girl crossed quickly, placed the napkins near the washstand and turned to leave. On the threshold she swayed. Catherine rose at once, caught her by the elbow, and felt heat through the thin sleeve. Not fever heat from days-long illness, but sudden kitchen heat, overwork and no food and too many stairs. "Sit," Catherine said. "Now. I must carry the silver back. Mrs. Pike will dismiss me. You will fall on the staircase and break your teeth. Sit." The girl obeyed because command, delivered clearly, could cut through panic where comfort could not. Catherine guided her down to the settee and reached for the water carafe. It was nearly empty. She poured what remained into a glass and held it out. The maid drank in quick, ashamed swallows. "What is your name?" "Lucy, miss." "When did you last eat, Lucy?" The girl looked at her hands. "Since noon, miss. Perhaps before, I do not recall." Catherine scanned the room, found a side table with sugared almonds in a dish left for guests who would never come to this corridor, and brought it over. "Take 3 now, 3 more in a moment. Slowly." Lucy stared as if permission itself were suspect. Then she took 1 almond, then 2, then 3. Colour returned in a faint wash to her cheeks. Her breathing steadied. Voices sounded in the hall. Male, then female, then nearer. Lucy stiffened and made to stand. "Remain seated," Catherine said quietly. "If anyone asks, I kept you from fainting onto their silver. They may thank me later." The latch clicked. The door opened wide. Lady Whitcomb entered first, silk rustling like dry leaves, with Sir Percival Denton at her shoulder and the Dowager Lady Marchmont behind him, jewels cold as frost against her throat. Miss Eleanor and Miss Agnes followed, curiosity unmasked in both faces. The room shrank around rank and perfume. Lady Whitcomb took in the scene in one sweep, Catherine standing near the settee, the maid with a water-glass. The dish of almonds moved from table to lap. Her expression did not alter. That was the most dangerous sign. "Out," she said to Lucy. Catherine spoke before the maid could rise and stumble. "She is unwell. 2 minutes more and she can walk safely." Sir Percival frowned. "Is this a servants' infirmary, Lady Whitcomb?" "No," Lady Whitcomb said, eyes on Catherine. "It is a room where instructions are obeyed. Miss Muller, you overstep." Lucy struggled to stand anyway, fear stronger than dizziness. Catherine took the napkin stack from her hands and set it aside. "Lean on my arm," she murmured. To Lady Whitcomb she added, "She nearly fell in the corridor. If she falls with your guest's plate, the damage will be louder than this." The Dowager watched with open irritation. "Dismiss the girl later. We have business now." Lucy looked from face to face, saw no mercy in any of them, and fixed her gaze on the floor. Catherine walked her to the door, kept her steady through the threshold, and whispered, "Kitchen first. Tell Mrs. Pike you were sent for hot broth by Miss Muller. Say it exactly." Lucy nodded and vanished down the corridor with the desperate speed of someone fleeing weather. Catherine turned back. Lady Whitcomb had moved to the hearth and stood with one hand on the mantel, not seated, not informal, all authority. Sir Percival remained by the door as if to ensure no one else entered. The Dowager took the armchair and set her cane across her knees, like a magistrate about to hear evidence. Miss Eleanor and Miss Agnes stayed near the mirror, arranged as attentive witnesses. Lady Whitcomb's voice came smooth and low. "You have cultivated a regrettable taste for scenes this evening." "I prevented one, my lady." Sir Percival snorted. "Impudence in plain wool is still impudence." Lady Whitcomb lifted 2 fingers, and he quieted. Miss Muller, Lady Marchmont, has been expressing concern regarding your dance with Lord Harrowmere. His household is in mourning. His conduct, therefore, is observed with unusual care. We would avoid misunderstanding. You will answer plainly." Catherine felt the room tilt by a degree she could not show. This was not concern. This was net and hook and line. Lady Whitcomb continued, each word placed. "When Lord Harrowmere requested your hand, did he insist after you declined?" "He requested, I accepted." "Did he lead you away from the line in a manner that might suggest private familiarity?" "He adjusted our path when my slipper failed." Miss Agnes gave a small laugh. "How gallant and how convenient!" The dowager tapped her cane once. "Did he speak to you of your guardian?" "Yes." "Did he denounce Lady Whitcomb?" "No." Lady Whitcomb's bracelets chimed as she shifted. "Did he ask you to meet him in this anteroom?" Catherine held her breath one beat too long. Sir Percival's gaze sharpened. Miss Eleanor's mouth curved with anticipation. The trap had narrowed to one plank. A lie now could buy shelter for a week, perhaps a month. A truth now could empty her trunk onto the curb before midnight. "He advised me to take 10 minutes away from the floor," Catherine said. "Because I was injured." Lady Whitcomb's voice went softer. "That is not what I asked." "It is what occurred." Sir Percival stepped from the door, impatience flaring. "Girl, attend. Her ladyship asks whether Lord Harrowmere sought a private interview with a dependent woman under his patron's roof. Answer yes or no." Catherine looked at him, then at Lady Whitcomb, then at the dowager whose expression had hardened into thin displeasure. She understood with sudden, absolute clarity what had been arranged. A rumour from this room would move through 3 houses by dawn and 12 by supper. Lord Harrowmere had compromised an unprotected woman at a public assembly. Lord Harrowmere had violated mourning restraint. Lord Harrowmere had forced an interview. With enough repetition, even his rank would need to answer. Lady Whitcomb could offer to quiet the tale for a price, social or legal. A favour, a signature, a marriage market restored by scandal diverted. Catherine felt the old survival instinct rise, the one that said, "Bend now, endure later." Then she saw Lucy's unsteady hands around the water-glass, and the memory aligned itself with the present, people collapsing quietly, while others discussed strategy over their bodies. "No," she said. Silence snapped taut. Lady Whitcomb did not raise her voice. "You misunderstand me, Miss Muller." "I understand, my lady. The answer is no." Sir Percival's face mottled. "Unwise creature!" The dowager leaned forward, cane tip digging into carpet. "You are either naive or disloyal. Which?" Catherine kept her hands still at her sides so no one would see them tremble. "Neither." "I will not accuse a man falsely because the room prefers a useful story." Miss Eleanor took one step forward, colour high in her cheeks. "You owe this house obedience." "I have given it in labour," Catherine said, and the calm in her own voice startled her. "Not in perjury." Lady Whitcomb moved then, one measured pace, enough to close half the space between them. Her smile was gone. "Perjury is a legal word. You have no standing to employ it." "I have sufficient literacy to know its meaning." For one instant, naked hatred crossed Lady Whitcomb's face, unpowdered and sharp. It vanished at once beneath composure. "Very well, let us simplify. You will state in Lady Marchmont's hearing that Lord Harrowmere's conduct compromised your reputation. In return, I restore your wage book entries from last year and provide a reference for a provincial post before Lent. Refuse and you leave my protection tonight with nothing." The offer landed like a blow because it was plausible, because hunger had weight and roofs had price and winter was a hard negotiator. Catherine saw the attic trunk, the hidden papers, the street in sleet. She saw too the Viscount's face on the dance floor when he had named what everyone else ignored, not kindly, but accurately, and accuracy had become a form of mercy she had almost forgotten existed. She lifted her chin. "Then I refuse." Sir Percival muttered, "Madness!" The dowager sat back, assessing now rather than directing. "Lady Whitcomb, your companion is either unusually principled or unusually foolish." "They are often the same at that age," Lady Whitcomb said. A voice from the half-open doorway cut through the room, low and unmistakable. "Not tonight." Catherine turned so quickly pain flared up her left leg. Adrian Vale stood in the corridor light, one gloved hand resting against the doorframe, as if he had been there long enough to hear all that mattered and had chosen his moment with deliberate care. His expression had not changed. His eyes had. Sir Percival straightened at once. "Harrowmere! We were conducting private—" "I heard," Vale said. Lady Whitcomb recovered first, dipping into a perfect curtsy that did not disguise the tension in her shoulders. "My lord, this is an unfortunate misunderstanding. We sought only to protect all parties from gossip." "You sought testimony," he said. "You did not receive it." His gaze moved to Catherine for one brief second. Not tender, not soft. Certain, then back to Lady Whitcomb. "Miss Muller will return to the main hall when she chooses. No one will detain her in side rooms again this evening." Lady Whitcomb's fan tightened in her hand until the ivory ribs creaked. "My lord, Miss Muller is under my household direction." Vale took one step into the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "At this assembly she is under mine." The words dropped into the air and held there. Miss Agnes stopped breathing audibly. Miss Eleanor looked from one face to the other, as if recalculating a game whose rules had changed mid-play. Sir Percival looked away first. Catherine felt the floor steady beneath her despite the throbbing at her heel. She did not move toward Vale. She did not move toward Lady Whitcomb. She stood where she was, between command and command, and for the first time in years she did not feel like furniture being moved. The dowager rose with effort, using her cane, and glanced at Catherine with a new, reluctant attention. If the girl refuses scandal when offered shelter for it, she is not entirely common. Lady Whitcomb's reply came clipped. "She is sentimental. It will pass." "Perhaps," the dowager said. "Perhaps not." Vale stepped back into the corridor, leaving the doorway clear. "Miss Muller." It was not an order. It was an opening. Catherine crossed the room on her repaired slipper, each step measured, and passed Lady Whitcomb at arm's length. Lavender struck her like smoke. No hand reached to stop her. At the threshold she paused and turned, because one thing remained precise enough to say. "The maid who left this room needs broth and 10 minutes off the stair," she said to no one and everyone. "If she is dismissed for obeying me, dismiss me with her." Then she walked into the corridor beside the Viscount, head level, blood drying in her slipper, while behind her, silk rustled and no one answered at all. The corridor lamps hissed in their glass cups as Catherine came level with him, and for 6 paces neither of them spoke. Music leaked through the walls in muffled pulses, bright and distant, as if another world had been sealed behind plaster and gilt. Her repaired slipper held once, then slipped at the arch, and she caught her breath when pain lanced up from her heel. Vale heard the intake and stopped so abruptly she nearly struck his shoulder. He did not touch her. He looked down once at the edge of her skirt where the satin darkened near the hem. "Sit," he said. "There is no chair in this passage, my lord." "Then we will find one." He turned toward a narrow door opposite the retiring room and opened it without waiting for permission from any steward. It was a small card room, empty at present, with a round table, 4 straight-backed chairs, and a single branch of candles, burning low in the hearth mirror. Cold had crept in from the windows. The room smelled of extinguished tallow and damp velvet. Catherine stood at the threshold and did not enter. "If Lady Whitcomb seeks me, she will be informed you are with me." "That is precisely the problem." His gaze met hers, level and unreadable. "Inside!" It was an order shaped as shelter. She hated that she understood the difference at once. She crossed into the room, set one hand on the chair back, and lowered herself before her leg gave way of its own accord. Vale closed the door to a narrow gap and remained by it, broad shoulders cutting off most of the corridor light. He did not pace. He did not speak. He watched the space beyond the latch like a man accustomed to holding lines no one else could see. Catherine bent to her slipper, fingers clumsy from cold and strain. The bent pins had shifted. Blood had stiffened the inner seam. She tugged once and winced. "Leave it," he said. "If I leave it, I cannot stand." "You are not standing. I am required to stand." "By whom?" She looked up. "You know by whom?" His jaw set. The pale scar near his collar pulled tight against the skin. He stepped forward then, one measured stride, and held out his hand without ceremony. In his palm lay a clean linen handkerchief folded into a narrow strip. "Wrap your heel," he said. "Not the slipper, your heel." She took the linen because refusing would waste time, and he had already spent enough of his reputation on her in one evening to make her uneasy. She unwound the broken shoe, peeled it from her foot, and saw fresh red along the edge, where leather had bitten through skin. Shame burned hotter than the cut itself. A woman displayed in borrowed satin with one bare stockinged foot in a Viscount's card-room was exactly the image Lady Whitcomb would have designed if she had wished to finish her. Vale turned his head slightly toward the door while she bound the linen around her heel. He gave her the privacy of inattention without giving up vigilance. The distinction struck her more than courtesy would have. By the time she tied the knot, the third waltz had begun beyond the wall, slower than the earlier sets. The rhythm carried through timber and plaster, like a remembered pulse. Vale had not moved from the door. "You heard all of it?" she asked. "Yes." "All of Lady Whitcomb's offer?" "Yes." Heat climbed her throat again. "Then you heard me refuse wages I cannot afford to lose." "You refused a lie." "A lie may keep a roof in January." "A lie of that size does not stop at roof and coal." His voice remained low, controlled. "It names a man a predator in a public register. It follows you as the woman who profited from accusation. It follows any child in your care. It follows every petition you sign. They offered shortbread and long ruin." She stared at him, startled by the precision. "You speak as if you have measured this before." "I have." He said nothing further. The room seemed to narrow around that single-clipped answer. She placed her damaged slipper on the table and pressed her palm to the edge to steady herself. "You were in the doorway for some time," she said. "You waited." "I needed Lady Marchmont and Sir Percival to hear enough before I entered. If I spoke too early, Lady Whitcomb denied. If I spoke too late, you stood alone. Timing matters." The words were practical. The care beneath them was not. A burst of laughter rose from the corridor, passed and faded. Vale did not glance away from the crack of light at the door. Catherine watched his stillness and understood with a strange, sharp certainty that he was holding himself in place by effort rather than ease. Men like him were not denied entry to any room in London. Yet he remained where she had been cornered, as if leaving before she could walk would violate a rule only he observed. "You should return to the hall, my lord," she said quietly. "If you are seen absent too long with me, they gain what they wanted by another road." They have already seen enough to invent what suits them. Let them now see what I state." She waited. He did not fill the silence. At last she said, "And what do you state?" He turned from the door and faced her fully. "That you are under my protection for the remainder of this evening," he said. "That no one questions you without me present. That no one moves you from room to room like inventory. That any complaint regarding your conduct comes to me in writing by noon tomorrow signed." His tone did not rise. The words landed harder for it. Catherine felt the breath leave her in a slow, unsteady thread. Protection in that world was never free. It was attached to obligation, rumour, debt, or marriage contracts drafted before the ink dried. She knew the price of patronage too well to mistake it for benevolence. "And after tonight?" she asked. His eyes held hers, winter grey in the candlelight. "After tonight we proceed to law." Fear and relief struck together, neither willing to yield. "Law has belonged to Lady Whitcomb for 2 years." "Not all of it." He reached inside his coat, withdrew a folded card, and set it on the table beside her broken slipper. Not a love token. A name, Mr. Elias Brent, Chancery Solicitor, Lincoln's Inn Fields. Beneath, in Vale's hand, one line, "Receives Miss Muller at 8." Catherine looked from the card to his face. "You arranged this before the assembly?" "Yes. You expected trouble. I expected Lady Whitcomb to accelerate once I danced with you." The bluntness made her flinch more than delicacy would have. "You used me as bait." His mouth hardened. "No. I removed you from a line of men examining your price. The acceleration was hers. She should have answered with caution. Instead, truth came out raw. And if I had agreed to her bargain in that room, if I had accused you, then I would still have sent you to Brent at 8. She stared at him, unable for a moment to sort anger from gratitude. Why? At that, something shifted in his expression. Not softness, not confession, but a fracture in the stonework. He looked past her shoulder toward the dark window glass, and spoke as if reporting weather. "I have watched Lady Whitcomb's household accounts for 11 months, he said. "I know what she pays for amber powder and imported silk. I know what she records for kitchen coal. I know the variance between declared wages and disbursement. I know your father's final shipping note was called reckless in every club in St. James's, while no one read the endorsements. I know because my brother handled one tranche before he died and wrote one letter he never posted." Catherine did not move. He continued, each word measured. "I saw you in Covent Garden in sleet carrying 3 parcels marked Whitcomb while your own boots took water. I saw you leave an apothecary in Drury Lane last month after paying for a kitchen maid's bandages with coin wrapped in plain paper. I saw you tonight give your only 10 minutes of safety to a maid who could offer you nothing. Do not ask me again whether I know what I am doing." The room had gone utterly still. Even the music beyond the wall seemed farther away. Catherine felt each beat of her pulse in her bound heel, in her throat, in her fingers, where they gripped the chair. "You were watching me," she said. "Yes." "For what purpose?" "For proof." "Of what?" He answered without pause. "That I was not mistaking endurance for acquiescence." The line cut through her defences with surgical precision. She looked down at the card on the table, then at the handkerchief stained where it touched her skin. The Viscount, who had barely spoken in public, had just given her an account. No gentleman offered a dependent woman, unless he intended consequences that could not be recalled. "You understand what this will cost you," she said, "less than it costs you to stand still." He moved then, finally, away from the door and toward the bell pull near the mantel. One short ring. A footman appeared within seconds in the corridor gap. startled to find the Viscount in an unused card-room. "Broth," Vale said. "Bread, now, and another pair of ladies' slippers from the cloak steward. Soft sole." "Yes, my lord." No announcement, no commentary. The footman vanished. Catherine closed her eyes for one breath, opened them again, and found Vale where he had been, not near enough to crowd, not far enough to abandon. Her skin prickled with awareness she refused to name. The body had its own language, unwelcome and undeniable. "You issue commands as if walls obey," she said. "Most walls do." "I do not." His gaze flicked once to her face, then to the blood-darkened slipper on the table. "You refuse 3 people with rank and 1 with money in a locked room." "I had noticed." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The smallest alteration there and gone. It changed the whole geometry of his face and unsettled her more than anger had. A knock came. The footman returned with a tray, steaming broth in a handled cup, 2 slices of bread, and a pair of plain kid slippers in dove grey, likely claimed from some forgotten cloakroom reserve. Vale took the tray, set it before Catherine, and dismissed the man with a glance. "Eat," he said. "I am not your—" "Eat!" The command held no impatience now. It held necessity. She obeyed because the smell alone made her hands shake. She broke bread, dipped it, and swallowed slowly until the hollow ache beneath her ribs eased from knife edge to manageable pain. Vale remained standing by the door, facing outward, as if guarding her from interruption was an assigned duty he would not delegate. He did not watch her mouth. He watched the corridor. By the time she finished half the cup, warmth had reached her fingers. She set the bread down and tested the new slipper against her bound heel. It fit well enough to walk without tearing skin. "Thank you," she said, the words rough in her throat. He inclined his head once. "When you're done, we return to the hall by the main passage, in full view. So they may witness your protection. So they may witness your standing." She held his gaze. "My standing is not yet restored." "No," he said, "but it has begun." He opened the door wider then and waited, not stepping ahead, not drawing her behind, giving her the line of movement as if it belonged to her and not to him. Catherine rose, weight settling carefully into the new sole, and found she could stand without the sharp, white flare of pain. She placed Lady Whitcomb's ruined slipper back on the tray, a small, broken artefact of the evening's arithmetic, then took the card from the table and slid it into her glove. In the corridor light, Vale offered his arm. Not possession, not display, public fact. She set her fingers on his sleeve, and together they walked toward the sound of the ballroom, measured step for measured step, while every eye that turned toward them saw exactly what he meant them to see. They crossed back into the ballroom together, and the music faltered by half a beat before the musicians recovered. Catherine felt the turn of heads like weather against skin. Lady Whitcomb stood near the centre column with Sir Percival and the Dowager still in orbit around her, but the arrangement had altered. Sir Percival no longer smiled. The Dowager watched with narrowed eyes and a kind of cold interest that had replaced contempt. Miss Eleanor's fan trembled once before she snapped it open. Miss Agnes looked directly at Catherine's new slippers, then at Vale's arm, and said nothing at all. Vale stopped at the edge of Lady Whitcomb's circle and inclined his head with exact formality. "Lady Whitcomb, Miss Muller requires a carriage." Lady Whitcomb answered in a tone sweet enough to curdle milk. "My companion remains under my care until my household departs." "She has an appointment at 8, Vale said. "She will sleep." Sir Percival made a sound of protest. Vale did not look at him. Catherine drew one breath and stepped out of Vale's arm before anyone could name her a parcel passed from man to man. My lady, my heel is torn. I cannot complete the evening without staining your gown and your floor. She let the practical cruelty of the truth do its work. I request leave to return home. Lady Whitcomb's gaze cut to her, then to the ring of listeners pretending not to listen. To refuse now would look petty. To agree would cost control. She chose the shape that preserved appearance. Very well. You will ride with Martha and return directly. We shall discuss your conduct before breakfast. Yes, my lady. The dowager tapped her cane once on the polished boards. Lady Whitcomb, send broth to that kitchen girl as well. Your companion has shamed us all into decency. A flush rose beneath Lady Whitcomb's powder. Of course. Catherine did not thank the dowager. She did not trust gifts wrapped as pronouncements. She turned, curtsied to the room, because survival still required choreography, and left by the main passage in full view, with Martha hurrying behind and Vale remaining exactly where he stood until she reached the vestibule doors. At 8 the next morning, frost rimed the inside of the attic window and turned her breath white in the air as she knelt by the trunk and opened every secret she had made. The singed solicitor's letter came first, flattened and brittle, then the copied ledgers stacked in twine, then the petticoat with figures stitched into the hem, her fingers clumsy as she unpicked the seam and drew each folded strip free. She slid her father's grammar into the bottom of the satchel, and after one long hesitation added the small brass key she had found months ago in his old desk lining, labelled in his hand with one word, drawer. When she rose, her knees shook, not from cold. Martha met her at the back stair with a wrapped parcel and red eyes. Cook sent this. Bread and cheese, also broth for Lucy. Lady Marchmont's footman came at dawn and stood in the kitchen until Mrs. Pike handed it over. Is Lucy dismissed? Not today. Martha's mouth tightened. Sir Percival sent word that any dismissal this week would be discussed in his wife's hearing. Mrs. Pike has discovered religion. Catherine let out a breath she had not known she held. Thank you. Lady Whitcomb intercepted her in the rear hall before the side door, lavender sharp as ever, pantry key glinting at her waist like a medal taken in battle. You will return by noon, she said. I have not finished with you. Catherine held the satchel strap with both hands. I'm meeting Mr. Brent. A flicker, brief, but there. On whose authority? My own. Lady Whitcomb stepped close enough that only Catherine could hear. Do not misjudge your position because one Viscount indulged theatrics. Your attic can be emptied in an hour. Catherine met her gaze. Then you should send someone who reads German before they burn anything. For the first time in years, Lady Whitcomb had no immediate reply. Catherine bowed, turned, and walked into the morning hard with frost. Lincoln's Inn Fields smelled of wet stone and coal smoke. Brent's clerk took her name, looked once at her gloves, then at the Viscount already standing by the far window, and led her to a private room with 3 chairs and a green baize table. Mr. Elias Brent was narrow, grey and precise, with ink on 2 fingers, and no patience for ornament. Miss Muller, he said, rising, Lord Vale has outlined concerns. I prefer proof to concern. Catherine set the satchel down and began laying out her life in paper. Copied pages by date, discrepancies marked in her hand, the singed letter, the stitched strips from the petticoat hem, and finally the brass key. Brent read without interruption, only once asking, Can you translate this endorsement line exactly? She did. German to English, clause by clause, date by date, until even the clerk stopped pretending indifference and leaned nearer. Brent held up the singed letter with tongs. Attempted destruction. Useful. He tapped a column. Diversion from dowry trust into household maintenance under emergency declaration. Fraud if unauthorized. Criminal if forged. Both if witnessed. He looked at her over his spectacles. Can you testify under oath to every copy's origin? Yes. Can you withstand cross-examination designed to make you sound hysterical, ungrateful, and romantically compromised? Her throat tightened once. Yes. Good, Brent turned to Vale. We file this morning. Petition for injunction against disposal of assets and immediate production of originals. I want a writ served before she gets home. Vale nodded once. 3 days passed before the hearing opened in Chancery, and every hour of those days was measured by footsteps on stairs and the clink of keys. Lady Whitcomb did empty the attic. She found only blankets, stockings, and a grammar whose margins held no numbers, because Catherine had scrubbed them clean with bread and milk the night before. She searched the petticoat chest and held up the unstitched hem with triumph that vanished when nothing fell from it. She accused. Catherine answered only when asked, and slept with the satchel beneath her mattress until Brent sent a clerk to secure it. On the morning of the hearing, sleet returned. Their carriage halted on Fleet Street when a stable boy staggered from an alley carrying a bucket half his size, then folded to the stones as if his strings had been cut. People stepped around him. The driver cursed the delay. Catherine opened the carriage door before thought could intervene. "Miss Merler," the driver began, "help me lift him." The boy burned with fever and shook with cold. No more than 12. Mud on his cuffs, split knuckles, eyes unfocused. Catherine got one arm under his shoulders and looked toward the nearest apothecary sign through the sleet. "There," the driver hesitated. "Lady Whitcomb will have my place if we are late." "Tell her it was my order." He muttered, but he lifted the boy's legs, and together they carried him into the apothecary, under a rain of grey water. Catherine spent the coin Martha had pressed into her palm that morning on draught and clean cloth. When she turned from the counter, Vale stood in the doorway, wet to the collar, watching with that same unnerving stillness. He did not praise her. He took off his coat and put it over the boy. In court, heat from packed bodies and candles made the air thick. Lady Whitcomb sat in plum silk with Sir Percival behind her and a new solicitor beside her, young and confident and already sweating at the temples. Catherine stood at Brent's table in plain dark wool, her satchel open. Vale took a rear bench, not beside her, eyes fixed forward. Brent moved through evidence like a blade through cloth. Original ledgers compelled by writ. Catherine's copies, aligned entry for entry. Ink analysis from the clerk, proving 2 hands where 1 signature should have been. The singed letter entered and read aloud, including the forged downstrokes. Then Catherine took the stand. "Miss Merler," Brent said, "translate line 14. She did. "Line 21. She did. "Explain the date shift." She did, and the room changed as comprehension spread in little physical signs. A pen stopped scratching. A barrister leaned back. Sir Percival's jaw hardened. Lady Whitcomb's face remained composed until Brent held up the emergency declaration and asked softly, "Who benefited?" Catherine answered without looking at her. "Lady Whitcomb's household expenditures and her daughter's settlements." Cross-examination came exactly as promised. Ungrateful, emotional, influenced by a gentleman's attentions. She held to dates, to amounts, to signatures, to what ink did under water when old and when new. When opposing counsel implied she had fabricated the German entries, Brent produced a shipping clerk who confirmed her translations against archived manifests. Lady Whitcomb rose before her solicitor could stop her. "She lies," she said, voice finally breaking register. She has always lied. She took one step toward the witness rail, hand lifted. A bailiff moved faster, catching her wrist in midair. Gasps rippled. The Chancellor's face went to stone. "Enough," he said. The order came in clipped succession. Guardianship revoked. Control of Müller remainder estate restored to Catherine Müller. Immediate accounting and seizure of contested accounts, pending criminal review. Lady Whitcomb removed from management and censured for conduct before the court. Sir Percival did not meet anyone's eyes as he had escorted his wife out past the benches, where people shifted to avoid the sweep of her silk. In the antechamber after, the noise of the court dropped to a muffled roar through closed doors. Catherine stood by the chapel threshold with her satchel against her ribs, shaking now that stillness was no longer required. Vale came to stand beside her, close enough for warmth, not touching. "Stay," he said. She looked at him. "I ended the season," he said, each word dragged from somewhere guarded, "because I would not watch them price you again." The chapel doors opened for no one and closed on their own draught. Catherine answered with equal precision, "If I marry, I keep legal control of my accounts." "Yes." "I fund a servants' infirmary in my father's name." "Yes." "The boy from Fleet Street is apprenticed under protection and educated, not sent back to the yard." "Yes." She held his gaze a moment longer, seeing no flourish there, only resolve, and that familiar restraint stretched thin. "Then I will stay." By the first ball of the next season, held under Catherine Vale's own patronage, the Whitcomb name had gone quiet in London rooms where it once rustled loudly. Lucy worked in the new infirmary kitchen and no longer hid bread in sleeves. Martha supervised linen accounts with keys at her own waist. The stable boy, Thomas Reed, had ink on his fingers and a slate under his arm when he ran messages through the lower hall. Catherine stood at the top of the ballroom stair in ivory silk, bought with her own signature. Her father's grammar and the singed letter locked in Brent's fireproof cabinet. The copied ledgers lodged in Chancery Archive. Every piece of proof accounted for and preserved. The chandeliers burned clean. The floor shone. Voices rose, then hushed when Vale approached. He bowed once. "Dance," he said. She placed her hand in his, and they crossed the first set at the beginning of the evening, under every eye in London. He did not leave her side for that measure, and he did not claim another dance until the final candle had burned low and the last carriage call echoed from the vestibule. Then he returned, offered his arm again, and led her through the last waltz in a room that had finally learned her name.